I would like to introduce Brendan Conroy, who is going to be walking us through a workshop on Omnichannel. So Brendan, I'll hand it off to you and go from there.
Thank you so much. Share my screen for everybody.
All right, see it?
Excellent. So hi, everyone. My name is Brendan Conroy. I'm a senior business systems analyst with Twitter. I'm actually a Salesforce MVP as well, just like Bill. I've been since 2013. I've got 5 certifications. I've done a lot of projects for large companies, for Google, for Slack. So over time, I was a consultant. And I was also a session leader for the Salesforce Certification Study Group, which, going back to the question earlier about how to prep for exams, I actually was an instructor to try and help people prepare for exams. So today, we're going to be going over Omnichannel. I'll be telling you how it works. We're going to be doing a out-of-the-box use case, building it out in Trailhead. And then I'm actually going to give you a more complex use case as well. For context, we are somewhat short on time, or else I would have done a 2-hour session and made a really big implementation of Omnichannel, which again is all out of the box. And then after that, we can do a Q&A. So what is Omnichannel? It's a native tool on Salesforce that allows users to specify their availability and be able to accept records based on criteria. So for leads, for cases, for orders, you can specify that you're available and they would automatically be assigned to you. And one thing I like to point out to folks is that knowing the difference between what's offered out of the box and what would require code can save you a lot of money and time, as opposed to purchasing a third-party tool. And I would always suggest to play with it in either a sandbox or a Trailhead instance before purchasing anything. So here's our use case for the day. I want our cases to be routed to users based on if a customer has a paid subscription with us and how many product lines they've purchased with us. If a customer has purchased over 10 products, they'll be the highest priority. If they purchase between 1 and 9, they'll be second in line. And if they haven't purchased with us, it'll be considered the third tier. And users should only be able to accept up to 3 cases at a time, because we want to make sure that our agents aren't getting overloaded. They're not taking more cases than they should be. So we want to restrict it to 3 at a time. So let's build.
Shoot.
I got some. And if we have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. But here are the steps. As you can see, we got quite a few things to do, but I've put it in a step-by-step process, and I'll be doing along with you. Get out of presentation mode. I'll be going back and forth between the slides and my Trailhead, so you can follow along. So the first thing we need to do is to activate Omnichannel. Oh, excuse me, the first thing we do is to create a couple of fields. There's only 2 of them that we need. So we go into Settings, go to Object Manager, and we're going to be doing this on the case object. So find case, and fields and relationships to create our new cases, and of course, new. So the first one is going to be called is paid, and it's going to be a checkbox. This is to identify that the customer is paid, that they pay with us. And normally we do things like visibility, which profiles needed, but it's not really relevant for this exercise. So do save and new, and we'll get our second one. And that is going to be a number field. And that is number of purchases. Or, excuse me, number of products purchased. And normally we would restrict it to a certain length, but it's not really relevant in this case. So we have our two fields. Next up, we're going to enable Omnichannel. So let's go back to home here. And then go Omni. Go to Omnichannel settings. This is where you set it up initially. And very simply, enable Omnichannel. I'll take a step back just to talk about what skill-based routing is. If you wanted to route based on someone's language, the types of cases that they do, the types of leads that they do, if you ultimately just wanted to say this person's expertise is in a certain area, you can have those records be assigned to them based on their skills, as opposed to specifically which queues the cases are going into. So very powerful tool. One note on that is you have to do a little bit of code for that. So you have to write a trigger. But for what we're doing today, we're going to be just doing the out of the box. So now Omnichannel is active. Next, we go to presence configurations. And for the question, can we zoom the application? Of course. I'll make it super big on my side and hopefully that'll help. So next we'll go to presence configurations. You'll notice that originally we had just the turn on Omnichannel and we had a bunch of functions get added. And all you have to do here is up the capacity. In the case of this, it's just a little bit of configuration for Omnichannel. Do we want folks to be able to decline requests? Do we want them to automatically be accepted? In the case of what I'm doing, I'm making the actual capacity per agent. And I'm considering this in my head as 100%, which we will be discussing in a little bit of why. But all you have to do is up the capacity to 100. Next, we're going to go to the routing configurations. So how do we want these cases to be routed for Omnichannel specifically? Routing configurations. Question, would you write on the object trigger any object or Omnichannel specific object to trigger if code is required? I can actually talk about that at the very end because we're going to be showing the objects. And actually during my complex version, it talks about the agent work object, which is what's being referred to here. So now we've got the routing configurations. We're doing P1, P2, and P3. So we want P1s to be the first in line, P2s to be the second, P3s to be the third. The routing model is kind of an interesting attribute. So we're able to say, okay, this person is the most available. Say if you have up to 10, one person has 9, one person has 6. That would mean that if another case comes in, that the 6 will become a 7, as opposed to going to the person with the most cases currently. The reverse is true with least active. At least in my experience, I've always done most available. Then we have the work item size. You can either do this as a unit of capacity, so 1 case, 5 cases. Just for my preference, I like to do it as a percentage of capacity. In the last step, we put in essentially 100. Since we want to only allow up to 3, every case that comes in is going to be 30%. Routing priority 1, capacity most available, and capacity per percentage is 30. And we'll do that 2 more times. P2 is 2, 30%. And last one, P3, third in line, most available, and 30% as well. So now we have our 3 buckets that we want to do and how we want that routing to be as a whole. So next, we go to the service channel. This is where you determine the objects that you want to do it for. And in this case, we just need case. So pretty straightforward. And as you'll notice, you do case, contact request, which is, I guess, a custom object potentially that's within this new Trailhead instance, because I haven't seen that one, but leads, orders, but you can select which objects you're doing this for. And then next we do the presence status. Those are the available statuses that you can be when you're in Omni. I'm available, I'm busy, I'm on PTO. In my experience, I've always just done available. I've always just done available or busy. Some folks go crazy with that kind of thing, but I can try to keep it simple. And those presence stats, yep. So online and busy. Online. And you'll notice that you have the service channel. So that's the object that we just added. So we put in case. If I had put in leads, orders, or a custom object, that would be available too. But this is just telling Omnichannel, here's the object that we're doing it from. Next, we're going to create the actual queues that the cases will be assigned to. So go to queue.
Hey, Brendan, quick question.
Yeah, of course.
For the presences, you said that we were going to be creating 2, or is it just the 1?
Oh, I missed one. Thank you. So we created online. We needed busy as well. As I mentioned, you can make as many of these as you want for business use cases. I always just do online or busy. And next we'll go to the queues. And we're going to create P1, P2, and P3 again. However, since we enabled Omnichannel, you'll notice this new little function here. This is allowing you to say, this queue is related to this routing configuration. So we want P1, or cases that are in the P1 queue to be the first in the rotation. Ones in P2 queue to be the second in the rotation. So P1 to P1. Going to do this for the case object specifically. You know, technically need to bring everybody into it, but at the very least, bring in yourself. For the sake of this demo, I'm bringing everybody in. We're doing that for the other 2 queues as well. And make sure you have the routing configuration there too, because that's what ultimately tells Omnichannel that this queue needs to be factored into it. And P3 and P3.
So Brendan, you mind if I ask a very quick question as folks are wrapping up P1, 2, and 3 here? You mentioned Omnichannel. This is available for custom objects as well?
It is, to my knowledge.
Okay, very cool.
Yep. And then next, we're going to be creating the assignment rules now that we actually have the queues. So we're using standard assignment rules. In the more complex version that I'm going to be touching on after this, I used Process Builder, but you can also use a trigger or flow for it. And I'll describe why. So for this, I'm just going to create an entirely new rule. I'm just calling it demo. I'm going to make it active. And then we have 3 rules that we need. The first is if it's paid and the number of products is greater than or equal to 10, make them the P1 queue. Then if it's paid and products are 1 to 9, make it P2. And if it's not paid, make it P3. So I'm going to start with the P1. So let's find is paid equals true, and number of products is greater than or equal to 10. And this will be going to the P1 queue, because these are the first ones that we want to ultimately action. There are repeat customers, and we want to give them the best treatment. That's the first one.
I'm sorry, could you go back just a little bit?
Of course. Yeah, so is paid equals true, and number of products purchased is greater than or equal to 10. So those are the 2 fields that we created at the very beginning of the session, and it's going to the P1 queue. Good to go? Sounds as we're good to go. So next we'll go to the P2, and this actually has 3 filters that we're putting in. So this is for folks that are paid as well. Is paid equals true. And in this case, we're targeting ones that have purchased 1 to 9 products. So number of products purchased is greater than or equal to 1, but we want to put a stopgap in at 9. So number of products purchased is less than or equal to 9. And the queue is P2. Then we'll go into P3 as well as the last one. In this case, technically, I could just leave this as blank filters, but for the sake of the use case, we'll say is paid equals false, meaning they're free.
No, I appreciate that. You don't have to agree with it. Because I see different things than you do, and I appreciate that you just understand it.
Yep. 3 and P. Mixed up those fields in my head. So now we have our assignment rules. P1, P2, P3, that's based on whether it's paid and how many products the person has purchased with us. Next, we're going to actually add Omnichannel to the console. So here we go to App Manager. And we're going to find the service console. And then we click Edit on Service Console. And there's a bunch of stuff that we can do within the console to make it look nice, to add additional functionality. In the case of this exercise, all we need to do is go to Utility Items, Desktop Only, and do Add Utility Item. This is where we're going to be actually adding the widget for Omnichannel to the console. As you can see, you can add a bunch of different things to it, but we only care about Omni for this. And we don't need to do any other configurations to the Omni widget from here. So we can save that. And we're almost done. So now you recall that we added those presence statuses, the online and busy. per profile, you can have different statuses. So if you had 5 different statuses, it could be on one profile. If you had 3 statuses that are relevant to that profile, you can just set it to it. So now we'll go back. And go to profile. And in this case, we're going to be going for the system admin so we can actually see it. So I can just push the next button to get to system admin. And you'll notice at the very top of the screen, you have this enabled service present status access. And this is also at the bottom too, if you wanted, but here's a little quick version to get there. And we want to add busy and online to that profile. And as you can imagine, you have to go profile by profile in order to assign those. But now the system admin profile can fully use Omnichannel. So we get to have a little bit of fun now. Let's go to the service console. And you'll notice down here, I now have my widget. Get rid of that. And I'm currently offline. As you can see, we have online and busy, the present statuses that we created earlier. If you have more, if you created more of them, they would all show up here. Green means that you're available. Orange means that you're busy, but you're still technically online. And offline means you're just straight up out. And I'll go into more details about what offline does in a bit. So now go online, just so you can see what that looks like. And we have no active requests. So now we're going to make a few cases that are going to automatically be pushed to me. Make sure I didn't miss anything. Yep, perfect. So I'm just going to throw a case origin in there because I need it. But we have our 2 fields. So I'm going to start with a P1. So it's paid and they have 15 products. So it's above 10. For each of these, make sure to do assign using active assignment rule. The reason is these cases would be going into the queue that I'm part of. And anytime the cases go into that queue and I'm available, it's going to automatically assign it to me, which we'll see shortly. You can see immediately the new case came up. This is called a work item. It times you. It shows you how much time it's been in your queue ultimately. And you'll also notice that right now it's technically under my name. So the case owner went from the queue to me. If I were to hypothetically go offline and refresh the tab, it goes right back to that original queue. So when it goes into Omnichannel for you, you become the case owner. I'm just going to go back online again. See it? And I'm going to create a few more cases by cloning this. So now instead of 10 products, I'm going to say 5. So between 1 and 9. Got a question? Yeah, that is pretty slick. Make sure to assign using active assignment rules. And I've got AP2. That's coming in as well. I'm going to make 2 more. I'm going to make 1 more P2. So I can just straight up do, well, just for some variance, I'm going to make that 9. It's still a P2. Assign using active assignment rules. So now we're at our 3. And I'm going to make 1 P3. And this is not paid. And what you'll notice is I was limited to 3, so I didn't get this P3, which is now the 4th one, and that's staying in the rotation. So you're able to ultimately control how many cases an agent is seen at one time. And when I accept it, that stays with me. So even if I go offline, it's going to stay in my name. And you also get the my work, meaning it's staying in my name, and the ones that are in your queue. But if you go offline, those go away. This one stays with me. So to recap, tab. I've got one that stayed with me, one that's in P2, another one that's in P2, and one that's in P3. So that's how Omnichannel works. And I am going to go back to my slides. Hopefully everyone had was able to get that working as intended. I was actually going to talk about the more complex one that I've done with Omnichannel, which is all out of the box. So it starts out mostly the same, paid versus freemium, 10 plus. In this case, I did 4, 10, 9 for the second, 3 and under should be the third, and free is fourth. So I added a separate routing to it. And if we wanted to tag cases with specific priorities, depending on these attributes. So if they're a P1, make them a high priority. If they're P2, make them medium priority, that kind of thing. Users should be able to accept 3 cases at a time, but you can also work unlimited live chats. So in addition to using cases, you can also, as I mentioned, you have multiple objects, and you can have live agent too. So instead of using 30% per case, what I would do is I would, for the live agent object, make it 5%. So technically, I could have 3 cases and up to 2 live agents as the maximum. But if I wasn't working any cases, I could just take, trying to do the math on that, 20 live agents. So that's one way that's out of the box. You can control the types of objects that you're getting in and have more of a specific one than others.
Brendan, I have a question.
Of course.
Would you be able to go into a real world implementation and the pain point that it addressed?
Absolutely. Let me see if that is one of these. Process. Yeah, so this is it. For context, this was something I had created for a client way back when, and I did a smaller version for this demo. But what they were trying to do was they were new to Salesforce. They had a call center. They wanted specifically folks that have purchased a number of products to them to have a higher SLA, so it's service level agreement. So we want the ones that purchase the most to be the cases that are actioned first. Then they wanted to additionally tag them in specific ways to essentially update their priorities. They also wanted to tag who's accepting cases, who's declining them. If a case is declined, a specific reason why, so folks aren't just accepting things and declining them like cherry picking. As a whole, they wanted to have a pretty reasonable routing for their cases that's dependent on how much their customers have spent as a whole.
One more question.
Mm-hmm.
Does it at all conflict with the concept of first come, first serve, or is there a way to incorporate that as well?
Yeah, that would be, let's see, first come, first serve would be, yeah, I guess it does. I'll go back to the settings. It'll be a routing configuration if I'm thinking of it right. Yeah, because we have the most available, the least available, and I'm not sure about the third external routing. So yeah, first in, first out. I would have to think about how you would do that. because this is all based on one's capacity as a whole. Actually, something I'll show you too online. So now I've got my cases back. There's also something called Omnichannel Supervisor. Which is showing all of the active agents, how long they've been active, how many cases they currently have, or whatever record, whatever work item it is, what their capacity is, and what their workload is. So to your question about first in, first out, I think that this wouldn't apply to, at least to my knowledge, to Omnichannel, because this is based on the available agent's capacity as opposed to based on, say, the date time that the record was created. But yeah, there might be some way around it. I've just never really thought about it in that sense.
Brendan, one question for you.
Of course.
Looking through the Omnichannel, in the utility bar, you have the ability to accept cases. Is there a concept of you declining a case or turning it down?
Absolutely. That's actually a setting. I just had to remember which section that's in. It does take me a second to remember. Yeah, I think it's a presence configuration. So you can either automatically accept them, so it just gets pushed to you, you get no choice, or you can also decline requests. And when you enable that, you can also, if you decline a request, you can automatically go offline if you want to. And you can also have a pick list that says, here's the reasons I'm declining it. This isn't my expertise. This needs to be transferred to someone else. You specify those in presence decline reasons. And since I just enabled that, we can at least see it, some of it. So I'll just say, not my expertise. And I'll just say different department, but you can do whatever you want. So I'll go back to the console. I'm actually just going to do a hard refresh on it just in case. So now you can see we can decline the case. And let's see, there's another setting I have to do in order to get the options to pop up. But yes, ultimately you can decline cases and call out explicitly why you're declining them. A question earlier was around the objects. I'd mentioned that there's something called the agent work object. If you want to do any kind of automation based on Omnichannel, like say if someone declines it, you want to set their name to the case, you want to set the reason to the case itself, you want to throw it to a specific queue, you do it on that agent work object itself. And as I mentioned, I did that in Process Builder previously. You could do that with a trigger or a flow as well.
Very cool. Thank you.
Anything else you can do that's out of the box? You can also use escalation rules to say if a case has been in. Looks like my audio is a little bit janky. Hopefully folks can hear me. One other thing you can do within escalations, or excuse me, within the native functionality, you can use escalation rules to say if a case has been in, say, P1 for an hour, then automatically throw it to a higher priority. If I was doing the full version of this, it would look more like this. I actually did a step-by-step of how that process works. So instead of just using P1, P2, P3, I had P1 escalated, P2 escalated, P3 escalated, and then the ones that we created. And if a case stuck around in one of the P1, P2, P3 queues for too long, I would automatically have it go to the escalated version, and that would have a higher routing priority to it, which helped make sure that cases that were starting to go kind of stale were being put to the top of the rotation. So that was another value add that the client wanted, was to make sure that when agents are working cases, that if something's starting to go stale, make sure that it's routed again and at a higher priority. As I mentioned, you can tag things to the case. So accepted date, declined date, who declined it, the reason that they declined it, all in the case, so that you can actually report on it. And some other use cases that you can consider. You can restrict users from transferring cases back to the queue without a reason and timestamp the date that it was moved back there. That's sort of what I was referring to earlier. We want to make sure that they're not cherry picking. They're not looking at the case and throwing it back. There has to be some auditing of why they're accepting it. And if they are accepting it, we know who did it. And if they're accepting it, decline it, we know who did it and why specifically. You can also restrict users from transferring the case from one another. So this is something that happens in call centers where two people might be working together and they may be cherry picking as a team. So you can have a validation rule that restricts that. You can also restrict users from manually changing the status of a case instead of an automation updating it. This was something that was in my two process builders, one on the case, one in the agent work object, where the only way to change a status was based on, say the agent sends an email, they make a specific update to it. So they're not manually saying this is going from new to closed, they have to go through a set process. You can list the decline by user, as I mentioned, update multiple fields on the case. That's what I mentioned with the dates themselves. Omnichannel routing based on a set numerical value as opposed to a percentage. In this case, I like to just think of things in terms of 100%, and cases would be 30% each. So you can get up to 3 to 90%. If you try to get to 4, it would be 120%. So that's why it stops at 3. But you can also just do it as a straight up numerical value. You get 5 cases, that's it. And you can also robbeting of cases. So if there's regional differences, you want them to only go to these specific folks. So that's another really powerful one. And here's some examples of when to use custom code or third-party tools. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, it's good to know what's available out of the box and also what you would need code for. If you wanted to update another system that's outside of Salesforce after applying a macro. So if I wanted to apply what's called a macro, where you're sending out an email and updating the case, if you wanted to update your internal database that say that person's membership, their membership status, you would have to have code to that to move the data from one system to the other. You test an out-of-the-box tool in your sandbox, and part of the business process use case, part of the business use case that you're trying to solve for is missing. That's why I said at the very beginning that you should test in a sandbox and make sure that all specific business use cases that you have are accounted for. If you want to send surveys with a different look and feel than what's natively possible, there is a native Salesforce survey platform. It's fine, but if you want more customized look and feel to it, you consider things like get feedback, form assembly, and those are ones that I've personally used and recommend. If you want a highly customized interface, so if you want the general look and feel to be different, you need code for that in all probability. If you wanted to reference the actual products that were being purchased by the customer on the case without having to go into the contact. So you have to have a little lightning component showing here are the 10 products that person has had. And there are different ways of doing that, but if you needed a visualization of it. If you wanted to automatically have contact related data be added into the case from live agent. So if, say, the customer goes to your community, fills out a form, it creates a live agent request with you. If you wanted things like their region, their membership status to automatically get fed in, that's where code would be required. If you wanted a particularly complex round robining assignment, I mentioned you could do basic ones out of the box. If you've got a large instance, if you have a lot of teams, then more often than not, I would recommend doing either a trigger or potentially you could get away with a flow. It just depends on how complex it is. As I mentioned earlier, if you wanted a skill-based omni-channel, language, type of expertise, but specific routing on your skill set, you need a little bit of code for that. And if you want capacity to be based on the total number of cases owned and not based on how many cases an agent accepts. This is actually slightly out of date because from what I understand, there is a function that is, I think in beta right now, that is intended to help with that. I just haven't tested it yet, so I can't say definitively how it works. And the question is, could you use this for information requests about your company? Could you expand on the question a little bit?
Yeah, so I work with a local Rotary Club, so they don't really have service requests like that. They have more questions about where the club's at, what are they doing, what's coming up. So that would be more of the questions that would be asked of us. And I just didn't know if it made sense to create something like this, attach it to our website so we could have those conversations a little bit more quickly than the way we do it currently.
Yeah, at least with the answer is yes. Ultimately, I'm trying to think of the most scalable way for it. That more often than not would be a use case for macros, where you're saying, I'm gonna have this templatized email and I'm gonna send it out to them. So if an agent looks at it and says and realizes that they're just trying to get basic info, they select a preset macro and it will send out the email, it'll update the case, say to close, but it'll send out those details. I would have to think if there's a more scalable way about that, but I think that would be a use case for macros as a whole.
No, I think that would be perfect. Thank you.
Of course. I've got a few more comments. What might be another use case for omnichannel other than case routing? Great question. So lead routing, that would be another very common one. So leads are coming in, you want to have them routed in a specific way. You want to have them routed by geo, potentially by skill set. Same exact concept when it comes to leads itself. And of course, if someone uses a custom object, that there is that concept of someone has to accept and take ownership of that based on availability. That would be another use case. But the most common ones I see are leads and cases. And if you configure more than one object, do they all show up in the queue? Another great question. Out of that, I'll show you. The answer is ultimately it depends, but there's a few elements of why. And service channels. And I'm just going to use leads in this case. So depending on what you have in the queue too. So if I go back to this, as you can see right now, I only have cases. I would have to have leads and cases. Like say hypothetically, I'm a hybrid kind of employee that does both leads and cases. I have access to this P1 queue. Now it has access to both case and leads. I'm trying to think if there's any other thing I have to do for leads off the top of my head. Oh, I actually do. Trying to figure out if I have to put in another thing specifically for leads. It's under statuses. Nope, other one. And this will just take a second ultimately. So my other channel would have to be leads as well. So now Omni does both leads and cases for that one queue. Go to Omnichannel Supervisor. Actually, tell you what, I'll go to Service Console first, just to make it a little cleaner. I have to be online to see myself. You'll notice that my channels, it originally was just cases. Now it's leads as well. So if a lead went into P1, I would get assigned it. If a case went into P1, I would get assigned it. And since I've set it up so that I can do both as part of Omnichannel, that would be one way to have that hybrid model. Does that answer your question, Bill?
It does. Yes. Thank you.
Of course. What might be another use case for Omnichannel other than, yeah, routing leads? That's cool. Thank you. Awesome. So I hope that that was helpful for everybody. And I hope that everyone was able to do that functionality. I will send out the slides afterwards if you want to try and build out the more complex one. It could just be a fun little exercise. For context, if I go to, I'm just doing this process builder because I know that it works on this. But you could do it as a flow as well. But if you wanted to do the setting values to the case piece, or do any kind of automation on the omnichannel objects themselves, it's just called agent work. Yeah, so you can play with that and see what's helpful, and you can, as I mentioned, do it as a flow too. But that's another area that you can put automation within Omnichannel itself.
Nice. Very cool. Well, Brendan, really appreciate it. Looking at the time, we have about 5 minutes left. So I'll just say a few things, and if we have any other questions, we can go into those. This has been great. Great presentation. I had no idea what Omnichannel was before this call. So now I feel like I can at least speak to it from a somewhat educated perspective. So thank you for that. The presentation, if you want to send it to me, I'll actually just drop that into our Quip doc that I'll also share with recording. So I'll post that both on LinkedIn as well as through the VetForce community. And as I mentioned in the beginning of the call, if you haven't done so already, I would ask that everybody, if you can, join that LinkedIn group that we have for our office hours. So, that way, if you want to connect or if we want to continue the conversation, we can do it there. I just posted the link in the chat. If anybody has any other questions after this call, besides the chat, besides reaching out to the community, you can also reach me directly. I'll drop my email address here in the chat as well. So feel free to reach out and connect that way. But with that, just with a few minutes left, any other questions or any other comments before we part ways for today?
Well, just one last question. So you mentioned using a process builder to build in some automation. With process builder being phased out in the near future, would you recommend only using flows when building in automations?
It would either be flow or triggers. Yeah, and you'd have to make the assessment of how frequently to say cases or leads come in and what kind of updates you're making. Because I'm always just trying to think to myself, if I make a update of 10,000 cases, if I do a mass update, am I going to run into any row lock issues where there's a bunch of automation that's happening in the back end and the system's like, it's essentially choking on itself when you're trying to make a mass update. So it just depends on how you want to structure it. I believe that you can do it as a flow, even though I haven't done it personally, but I have done it end to end with Process Builder. So I would say there's a very high probability, and I know you can do it with a trigger as well.
Thank you.
Of course.
Okay. Any other questions? All right. Well, again, Brendan, thank you very much for walking us through that. And I hope that you guys can all join our session next week as well. I'll send out the details through all the various channels. So with that, I hope you guys have a great weekend and thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. Hey, guys.